this passage, you have to understand that Jesus was getting ready to preach. Those first two verses in Luke 15, it says, "Now the tax collectors and the sinners were all gathering around to hear him. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" Now again, you have to understand, Jesus is getting ready to preach. And he's in this great crowd here. He's getting ready to preach, and he's looking over his audience. And there were the tax collectors, and the sinners, and the Pharisees, and the teachers of the law, and then everybody else was there. The tax collectors. Some thought of them as cheats, men of extortion. Many had actually bought their job. In other words, they negotiated with Rome. These are Jewish guys who have negotiated with Rome for the right to extort taxes from the Jewish people that then will be paid to Rome. And the way they got paid, the way the tax collectors got paid, they kind of tacked a little bit more onto it. Some perhaps a whole lot more. And they just extorted their own people for the sake of the Roman government. And so they were all hated. Nobody liked the tax collectors. They were thought of as cheats. Then there were the sinners. Now, who were they? I learned something a long time ago in studying this passage. Someone wrote that any time you see the word sinners in the Bible, bracketed with those quotation marks, it meant harlots. Now just think. Harlots. Harlots in church. Boy, isn't that an interesting picture? Prostitutes, streetwalkers. And then there were the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, religious men, men of the cloth. And they looked the part, like some white-suited pompadour TV evangelist. Self-righteous, arrogant men they were. They looked down their noses and they saw those tax collectors. And God forbid they saw those sinners. And they said, how can this Jesus really be anybody worth listening to if he lets them into his church? Now, Jesus saw this. You see, Jesus is getting ready to preach. And he looked out there over his audience. And not only did he see his audience, he also saw what was in their heart and knew what they were thinking. Oh, wouldn't that be interesting? Brian stands up here to preach Sunday morning. He stands here and he kind of looks around and he sees all the thoughts that are running through the congregation. Boy, that'd be dangerous, wouldn't it? Now, what would even be worse if you could look back up here and see what we're thinking about? But Jesus saw what they were thinking. And it seems to me that Jesus thinks this: how can I make my audience realize that all men are sinners? That no one has the right to look down on someone else. Now, boy, I'm glad that in the church today we don't do that, aren't you? Yeah, I listen, I've heard it. Oh, if I could only have another hour, I could tell you a lot about that, but I don't have to tell you about it. You've seen it, and you may have even done it. The amazing thing about Jesus Jesus would cross barriers. He crossed cultural barriers. He crossed racial barriers. He crossed traditional barriers. And I submit to you tonight, folks, that if the church today is going to be the church that God wants us to be, we're going to cross the same barriers. And if we don't, we're going to fail miserably. No one has the right to tell someone else or think that someone else is not worthy. Okay, Jesus is thinking, how can I get them to realize that all men are sinners and need saving? Jesus said, I have come to seek and to save that which is lost. So Jesus tells them 4 parables here, or 4 stories. Now the first one is in verses 3 through 7. Notice, if you will. Then Jesus told them this parable. Suppose one of you had 100 sheep and loses one of them. Does he not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. And then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me. I have found my lost sheep. I tell you that in the same way, there is more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous people who do not need to repent. Now, the parable of the lost sheep. Now, I think the purpose of this parable is to show the value of that which is lost. Now, friends, until you and I place great value on the souls of men and women and young people, we will never be interested in going out there and seeking the lost. As there's an old saying, we will just become keepers of the aquarium and not fishers of men. Think about it. And just as they would leave, a shepherd would leave 99 sheep safe in the fold, go out and search for the one that was lost. So Jesus is interested in saving lost people. He isn't interested in just babying the sheep that are in the fold. Now, if you know anything about shepherding and sheep in that period of time, you know, number one, they didn't eat sheep. Not much. They sheared sheep. They produced wool. Now, they ate the goats. So a lot of times these sheep, from the time that sheep was born into the flock, they almost became a part of the family. And so they loved these sheep. You understand that. Any of you have a pet? You know, how many of you own a dog? Yeah, you know how you are. How many of you own a cat? You do not. Nobody owns a cat. Cat owns you. Yeah. The value of that which is lost. And then Jesus tells another parable here. It is in verse 8 and following. Or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Does she not light a lamp and sweep the house and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost coin. In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Now, in the first parable, it's interesting to note that which was lost outside the fold. Okay? Out there. Notice this coin was lost inside the house. So friends, that tells me There are lost people outside the church. But there also may be lost people inside the house. Now, that lost person might represent someone that hasn't been in your Sunday school class for several weeks. Have you checked on them? Well, that's what we pay the preacher to do. If you value that which is lost, doesn't matter who checks on them, does it? If we are concerned, if we value people like Jesus values people. This woman, the coin, it was one of 10 silver coins. It could have been her endowment. It could have been a belt she wore around her that represented her life savings or her endowment. Could have been a band around her head. But one coin. Now, if you lose $1, do you get very excited? Not really. There's probably a time you would have. But if you lose $100, if you lost a $100 bill, would you get excited about that? Yeah, I would. I lost a $100 bill one time. Linda sent me to the store. And I said, I don't have any money. So she gave me her $100 bill. And I stuck it in my pocket. Went to the store, and I'm going through the store, and let's see. Wait a minute. Where's that? Oh, I left it in the car. And I went to my car, and I looked, and I did. Oh, I pulled it out of my pocket in the grocery store. And I went every aisle, looking, did you see a $100 bill? Yeah.
Well, of course they're not.
And I called her. I said, did I leave that money on the kitchen counter? I can't find it. You what? No, she didn't. She said, no, it's not here. I don't know what you did with it. And then okay, calm down. Where could it be? I thought, when I got out of the car, maybe it fell out of my pocket. So I went back to the car and looked. No, and I'm looking. And in the front of my car, on some grass, was a $100 bill. Now, you think I did? Woo! Oh, man! Was I? Oh, thank you, Lord! Oh, thank you. Well, I wasn't quite that exuberant. But I'm going to tell you what. I was on the inside. This woman swept the whole house. Now, why was finding that $100 bill so important to me? And why was finding that coin so important to that woman? Because of the value of it. Now listen, folks. I don't care how big the church is. I don't care how little your church is. But if you don't value people, you're dead in the water. You're done. Why did Jesus come and go to the cross? Because he valued people. For God so loved the world. And you can take that scripture and just scratch through world and put your name there. That really makes it personal. Now, we've got to value people. And we've got to be willing to search out there. And we've got to be willing to search in the church. And I know it's hard to do. There are times I feel so guilty because we have people that come and it's hard to know everybody. And you have a lot of things to do. It's hard to touch everybody. But that's what we got to do. Jesus did. Then there's a third story. First is the value of that which is lost. Secondly is the value of the search. We've got to search. And thirdly, I want to talk to you about the value of the restoration. There was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had and set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. But after he had spent everything there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. And he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. Now, maybe you can identify with this young man. There are a lot of prodigals. As a matter of fact, Jesus is telling this story, and the younger son gets the press, but really Jesus is telling this parable for the purpose of the older son, the son that stayed home, representative really of the Jewish people. But here he is. God is like a father who had 2 sons. Now, this old man, this father, represents God. The younger ran away from home. He wanted the father's money, but he did not want the father's rule. And he left with his pockets jingling with the cash of his inheritance. His father stood waving as he left. "Goodbye, son." Now this is really the parable of a broken-hearted father. Because when you leave God to serve sin, you break the heart of God. You break his heart. The lust of the far country was on his heart before the dust was on his feet. And the more he got what he wanted, the less he wanted what he got. It's always this way when we turn our backs on God. The money runs out. The famine comes. The famine always comes. I promise you. It always comes. And here he is. All of a sudden, he has no friends. At one time, he is the person everybody wants to buddy with, because he had lots of loot, and he probably spread it around. But now everything is gone, and he has nothing, and the famine comes. As I said, it always comes. The famine comes to individuals who turn their backs on God. And let me tell you something, friends. I believe it comes to churches who are not involved in what God's will and purpose for the church is. Lynn and I went several years ago, when the I don't know if any of you remember what used to be the Southern Christian Convention. It was kind of an offshoot of the North American Christian Convention. And we went one year when it was in Florida. It was in Daytona Beach. And so we went, and we visited a church there. There was a lady in our church, choir director in our church, says, "Now I have some I don't remember as relatives or friends in this church, and y'all just got to go down to this church." And so we did. And you know what? Man, I thought, this place, it was hopping, man. It was packed. And people just when you came in, they were just howdying you to death, you know. And it was obvious, boy, this church is really on fire. Well, we went back about 3 years later on vacation, and we thought, hey, we're going to go visit that church again. We walked in. I went out to look to see if it's the same church. Preacher had left that was there when we were there the first time, and they'd had a preacher, and boy, was it different. Nobody spoke to us. And I thought, wow. Well, 3 years later, we went back again and went to that same church, and there was a young man preaching a trial sermon that day. And again, it was not the same church that it was the first time we ever went there. Now, what was the difference? There's a difference in the people. There was no excitement. No sense of, man, we're growing, we're interested in people or anything like that. I think they became a prodigal church. They had left the purpose for which we exist. So there are prodigal people, there are prodigal churches. But here he is, a young Jewish boy, broke, hungry, away from home, doesn't know what to do. And so he goes out and gets him a job. Jesus is telling this story. And I'm sure as Jesus is telling this story, he's thinking, oh boy, just watch him now. And he went out and hired himself out to a citizen of that country to feed pigs. Now, can you just imagine the look on all those Jewish people's faces? Thinking that and Jesus is pointing out the fact this is just how low this guy had sunk. He can't go any lower. For a Jewish man to go out and hire himself out to feed swine, you just can't do anything worse than that. And here he is. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating. And it says that no man gave him any. Where were all his friends? He didn't have any. That's the way the world is, isn't it? But I love what verse 17 says. Verse 17 says, he came to himself. Now that tells me there's hope. There's hope. He came to himself and he said, how many of my father's hired men have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I'll set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men. So he got up and went back to his father. Now here he is. He's rehearsing what he's going to say. He doesn't know what his father's going to do. He knows that he has absolutely no right to even approach his father and ask his father to do this. But he's going to throw himself on his father's mercy. Hopefully his father will have mercy on him. He's not worthy of this. He's going to say, I'm not even worthy to be called your son. And he goes. Thank God he came to himself. You know, Christianity is not so much be good or do good. Christianity is more come home. Come home. Now remember, Jesus is telling this story. The Father is God. Can I ask you, who's the prodigal here tonight? You and me. Or maybe our churches are prodigal. Like I say, it doesn't matter. Whether you're 1,000 or whether you're 10. We've got to be about the Father's business. Now, it says in verse 20, again, so he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, and filled with compassion for him, he ran to his son and threw his arms around him and kissed him. Now, why did that father see him a long way off? Because he was looking for him. Jesus paints a picture here of a dad who looks down that road perhaps every day and hopes that he will see his son. And perhaps that one day he looked and he said, well, you know, that looks like him. Oh, it is. It is. It's my son. And he runs and throws his arms around him. Oh, and I can see the weeping. Oh, God welcomes him home. Now, something very important here. You remember the little speech that he prepared for himself when he was in the pig pen? You know, one might think, well, you know, Dad's pretty happy to see me. Oh, well, maybe this ain't so bad. No, that wasn't this boy. This boy had had his heart broken and had his life broken. And he said, Father, I am no more worthy to be called your son. And he made his appeal to his father. And his father said, quick, bring the robe, bring the ring, kill the fatted calf. We're going to celebrate because my son has come home. My son, he says, who was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate the boy's coming. Now, the rest of that story is when the older son heard all of the rejoicing and the music and everything, and he asked the servants, what's all the noise? Oh, haven't you heard? Your brother came home, and your dad has killed the fatted calf. They're having a celebration. Now, this God is pictured as us. The church, then it was the Jews, but the attitude can go right over. And the older brother says, what? He never killed a fatted calf for me. What right does he have to come? And I say this. With all my heart, I want you to listen. When we built the new building in the horse pasture, some people said, I just built it for show. I got that. I get that. You know, I wasn't surprised to hear that. Because people say stuff like that, don't they? Sometimes people say things they don't mean. Do you agree with that? Sometimes we say things we don't mean. But you know that's okay. And then, when we started in it, and I knew this was going to happen. Knew it was going to happen. Boy, all of a sudden, people start showing up for church. Now, I don't know why. Don't ask me to explain this. I don't know why. They would never go into a church sanctuary. There's just something about the persona, if you can understand what I'm trying to say. And honest to thee, we had people coming in what wasn't pierced, I mean, it was piercings and tattoos and all of this. And I said, oh, God, you're doing it, aren't you? People were coming. And I know, listen, I believe with all my heart, they were coming out of a broken heart, just like this guy right here. They were coming to God. And not everybody, but some like, whoa, what are they doing here? We have to be so careful, folks. And I think, if nothing else, we need to pray, God, break my heart for a lost people. How do you think this guy looked as he comes back home? I think he stunk. I think he didn't have time to get any new clothes. He had rags on. But he was coming home. And I remember as a young person growing up and going off to Bible college in the 60s, we nearly lost that generation because all we could harp about was the length of guys' hair and the stupid way they dressed. And we almost lost that generation for a great, perhaps, deal we did. Rather than seeing the hearts of those young people and trying to, and what were they looking for? Love. And here we are, we're in the midst of a generation that's hooked on drugs and all these things.